Welcome to the Quality Meat Scotland podcast. Industry updates and best practice to promote, support, develop and protect the Scottish red meat sector.
Hello and thanks very much for choosing to listen to this. I'm Mark Stephen. At times it seems as if the entire red meat industry is under more or less constant attack, with claims, articles, even scientific papers saying how bad red meat is, not just for us, for our health, but also for the health of the planet. Over the next few weeks on these Quality Meat Scotland podcasts, we're going to try and address some of those claims head on by speaking to a range of contributors from around the world. Today, I'm joined by Diana Rodgers RD, who's a real food nutritionist and sustainability advocate. She's based near Boston, Massachusetts. Diana runs her own clinical nutrition practice, but she's also the author of several books, including one called Sacred Cow. Sacred Cow is a very detailed examination of some of the claims that have been made about red meat and debunks a lot of the current myths. Now, we thought it might be really useful for you to hear what she has to say. So first off, Diana, welcome. Thank you very much for taking the time to do this.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here.
No, not at all. It's literally, it's our pleasure. So, why did you write the book?
I've been wanting to write this book for a really long time and kept talking and bothering my co-author, Rob Wolf, for many years, actually. And he kept saying, look, I'm really good with timing and it's just not the right time. And we, sell 3 books because just nobody's really paying attention to this argument right now. And he was right. And I'm so glad we released it right in the middle of COVID, because here in the US, we really saw a big breakdown of our industrial meat system, much more interest in buying local, better meats. Everyone I know here who raises meat is completely sold out for the next 2 years. And, this debate between what is the right thing to eat for the health of our planet and the health of people has never been more polarized, and meat has never been more vilified. So the climate is right for somebody to really speak up and say, hey, is it really the meat, or is it, everything else we eat with the meat? Is it really cattle, farts that are the problem, or could it be fossil fuels? And could we be looking at this in a completely backwards way?
As I said right at the beginning of this, there's a lot of studies out there that, basically seem to cast quite a long shadow over red meat. You've got a section in your book where you basically say, look, if you look at one of these studies, here are some useful guidelines just to establish whether it's a black and white fact or not. So if you don't mind, I'm going to apply it to your book too. Is there a conflict of interest here? Were you paid by the red meat industry in America to write this book?
I was not. And I can guarantee you I make very little profit at all of this stuff. So for the film, I did disclose all of my funding, and I did take some funding from a couple of the meat companies here that do grass-fed meat, but the majority of the funding came from the public. And I used to work for National Public Radio, and they're considered independent because most of their funding comes from the general public. And so I'm transparent about my funders like they are, and I had no editorial control from the book or the film by any of my donors. But it is definitely something I did not choose to do for profit. I can guarantee that.
So, having got that out of the way, is red meat bad for us?
Bad for the planet, bad for our health. Where would you like me to start?
Wherever you like.
Bad to kill beautiful animals. I mean, there's just so many ways people have been saying it's bad, right? It's this trifecta of nutrition, environment, and ethics. It's just so wrong to kill an animal. And I think most people start with feeling badly, right? That an animal died, and envisioning all of the bad videos they see on the internet of animal handling from a few bad apples. But when we look at ethics of the plant-based industry and row cropping and what it means to pull meat away from, the most nutritious food, away from people who are food insecure, and demand that everyone eat plant-based proteins, which really only put money in the hands of the plant-based protein investors. All these companies are going public for $30 billion, things like that, selling a bunch of greenwashing, that they're pretending that no death happened for their food and that you can feel good and clean and pure about eating this product because it is only made with soybeans or oats or, whatever. and it's complete lies. And so in the book, I, as a dietitian, go through all the research about meat and show that these are really, so I'll start with nutrition. It's really correlations that they use for these. So meaning, in statistics, a correlation cannot prove cause. It just means two things happen to be associated with each other. So I could tell you that when we have warmer weather, we have more shark attacks, but that doesn't mean that the sharks are biting because the weather is warm or that the weather is warm because of sharks. It's just two things that happen to be correlated. And so when we look at the studies against red meat for health, what we see is typical vegetarians do tend to have a healthier life than a typical omnivore. But if you think about the lifestyle of a typical vegetarian, they're more likely to exercise more often, less likely to smoke and drink, more likely to be just, an active person, take care of their health a little bit more, maybe eat more fresh fruits and vegetables, and, so on and so forth. So those are lifestyle factors that we call confounding factors. So your typical omnivore in the United States drinks maybe more beer, might smoke cigarettes, definitely probably doesn't exercise as much as a vegetarian. When those things are adjusted for, and there was a large study that looked at that out of Australia of 60,000 people, when they adjusted for these confounding factors, they found absolutely no difference in longevity at all between meat eaters and omnivores. And actually being a vegan was, when they adjusted for everything, was actually a shorter lifespan. So we've got that. And then also when they've looked at people who shop at health food stores, so kind of adjusting for that general lifestyle, they found no difference at all between an omnivore. And there's so many benefits of red meat. It has nutrients that we can't get from plants or that are better absorbed in meat than from plants. It's satiating, so it fills us up. I mean, humans biologically are omnivores, and how incredible is it that a ruminant animal like a sheep or cow can eat things we can't on land we can't cultivate in temperatures where we can't be growing anything anyway, right? And convert that into the most perfect food that is why our brains are so big today.
One of the things I found really remarkable in your book was, you looked at the sort of obesity epidemic which has hit the USA, as it has in this country too, to be absolutely honest. You point out the fact that we're eating far too many calories and we're not getting enough nutrition. Now, what's the difference between the two?
We've got this curse of plenty in Western countries where people are overweight yet undernourished. So they're just eating too many empty calories and not getting enough of the right vitamins and minerals or the right amount of protein. So they're over consuming empty carbohydrates from ultra processed foods and industrially processed fats that are contributing to inflammation. And in many developing countries, we have a problem with malnourishment. And guess what? Eating more meat is actually a solution for both of those issues. So here in the Boston area, I work with a lot of people that want to lose weight. And one of the first things I do is actually have them increase their animal protein consumption while at the same time reducing their intake of processed foods like breads and sugary beverages and things like that. And when they're eating more protein, they feel fuller. Their blood sugar is more regulated, so they're less likely to have out of control diabetes, blood glucose numbers. And they just are getting exactly all the nutrients they need, and they stop having cravings for all this extra food that's not contributing to their health.
So how can there be such a disparity in the recommendations that are actually being put forward? Because I read one of the recommendations you quoted in your book was, I can't remember which organisation, but it was something like half an ounce of meat a day. You then go on and say, actually, you could be cheerfully eating 18 ounces of meat a day and it would do you a power of good. Why is there such a yawning gulf there?
Well, that study that you're mentioning is actually the focus of my new project that I'm working on right now. So that came from the Eat Land Set diet, which was started by a vegan billionaire in Sweden who flies around on private jets but yet says that her carbon footprint is nice and low because she doesn't eat meat. And we have to understand that in many Western areas, We have access to vitamin B12 supplements and iron supplements and all the goji berries and coconut oil and avocados, 24/7 to make a diet possible that might not include meat for at least some period of time. Most people in the world don't even have close access to a doctor, let alone a pharmacy to go pick up these supplements. And they may only be able to grow livestock locally because that's the only thing that thrives in their area. Anyhow, this Eat Land Set diet was authored by Walter Willett, who's actually here in the Boston area, and I interviewed for my film Sacred Cow. He didn't know what film he was being interviewed for at the time. And he is very anti-meat. There's a huge anti-meat bias going on in the nutrition world right now from people who like epidemiology, which is this correlational studies. So they're looking at, it's amazing. They'll look at two different populations, like I said, and say, oh, it must be the meat, and not thinking about, well, what do we eat with meat? We might be eating a bun and chips and all the different beverages that we'd have with it. So I'd argue that maybe the meat in the burger is the healthiest thing on that plate. So anyhow, the United Nations, just as a side note, is poised this summer to likely adopt the Eat Land Set diet as the diet for the United Nations, the ultimate goal for healthy people and a healthy planet, where you can basically only eat about a blueberry's worth of red meat per day. For chicken, it would be 2 blueberries worth, but yet for sugar, it would be 62 blueberries worth of sugar, if you're looking at it in size. And so I'm just trying to point out through this new group that I'm working on that I'm so excited about. So I'm going to plug it. It's called the Global Food Justice Alliance. I'm pointing out that this diet it's ridiculous. It's unscientific. It's elitist. And we have no business dictating what the whole world should be eating. People should be making up their own minds about what they should eat based on what grows the best near them.
If you look across the world of science or mainstream media or even social media, there seem to be a lot of people against eating meat. Now, I know vegetarians. I was a vegetarian myself for about 5 years once upon a time. But there seems to be much more of a weight of opinion against it than those numbers could possibly justify. Where's the drive coming from? Where's the impetus coming from for this?
Oh, gosh. Well, so meat is the most polarizing food in our culture. And it's because it represents so many things. And that's why it's been able to sort of absorb all of our stresses about our failing health on the planet. So I have a whole chapter in the book called Meat as Scapegoat. A scapegoat is something where we literally kind of sacrifice it and we put all of our sins on it. And that's what's happening with cattle right now and with red meat. It's coming from different directions. We think that it's bad because it has saturated fat, but that's of course been debunked, and people are realizing that butter is actually healthier now than margarine. And we were lied to about all of that. We think that, cow farts are destroying the planet. And I go in the book into the environmental case and talk about how that's actually just not true at all. And it's been completely misrepresented. But I think a lot of this comes down to this feeling of guilt that people have and this dissociation with nature and with farming that people have. So we've got, we've never seen more polarization in general in the world, right? We've got, here in America, you're either left or you're right. You can't be anywhere in between. And you're either urban or you're rural. And, we see rural people as not as smart and maybe backwards. And so of course they don't know all the things that, we as city people know. And that really carries out to farming as well. So, people in cities want it as engineered as possible and as far removed from any sort of natural state as possible. And I think there needs to be a lot more communication and respect for people who live in rural communities who actually are working with nature and improving nature. And I saw that a lot in the UK as well when we went there to film.
I watched a news item the other day on the BBC across here in Scotland, and it was someone who was producing artificial meat, and was having some success with it, and you saw people eating it, and you saw people quite enjoying it. But the fact of the matter is, you can't slap a patent on a cow, but the various stages necessary to make artificial meat, you can. There's money to be made in that.
Exactly. So there's more money to be made in taking a raw product and processing it into something new. And it's really clever here in the US. In Scotland, can you get Beyond Meat burgers?
No, not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Well, so I looked here, and they're very clever because they sell it in a very large package, so it looks twice as large as a pound of ground beef, and it's actually just it would be sold in an 8-ounce package versus a 1 pound package here in the US. So it's half as much, but sold in a package that looks twice as big with all this flashy marketing about how good of a person you are, and your, soul will be redeemed if you just buy this product instead. And it's actually, looks like a similar price point when you see them side by side on the shelf. But what you are not being told is that that's just half the amount of product. And so their product is actually almost twice as expensive as organic grass-fed beef. But yet it's being sold as, an equal comparison. And by the way, you can just feel so much better about yourself if you eat this.
You were the one that raised cow farts or cow burps, probably to be more precise.
Yes.
It's a fact. I mean, cows produce a lot of methane, and methane's a greenhouse gas. So surely farming red meat is bad for the planet.
Of course, right? Would you like me to break that down a little bit?
Yes, please.
Okay, so we've got many environmental claims against cattle, right? They produce methane. There's also, they take up way too much land. They use too much water, and they're inefficient with feed, and they're destroying our landscapes. So we've got all of these things, and I go piece by piece in the book Sacred Cow and really break down all of that and show why, just like I was saying with the nutrition argument and how they're going off just really bad research and really bad sort of methodology, it's the same thing with the environmental argument as well. So just really quickly with the land use argument, and that's how I won my book contract with my publisher, because I actually went with a vegan publisher who was sort of intrigued by this idea that cows can actually be the solution to climate change. And I won them on the land use argument. So before I get into methane, I'll just talk quickly about that. So 60% of our agricultural land worldwide cannot be cropped. So if we took grazing animals off that land, we would have a hole in our food system. And it's not like we can just go rewild it and turn it into forest, because not everywhere wants to be a forest. And if it wants to be a natural grassland, which much of that land does want to be, we don't have the herds of predators and the large stretches of land for the herds of animals that we need in order to keep a grassland healthy. And I go into this a little bit more in the book and the film, illustrating how we have to have movement. We can't have just continuous grazing. The animals need to be moved frequently in order for the healthiest ecosystem to happen. But the biggest point is that you can't just grow a Beyond Burger field or an Impossible Burger field anywhere. And there are just so many places. And those of us in Western countries like the US, you fly over the US and we just happen to have really fertile land. And so we just sort of assume the rest of the world looks like that. And that's why people in the US should get passports and travel a little bit more than they do. But the methane argument, I'll get to that. So there's two things we need to think about when it comes to methane. One is there's a big difference between the methane that is belched from a cow versus fossil fuels. So when a cow eats some grass, which is basically carbon, in its guts, the bacteria that are breaking that down produce methane. Methane is a greenhouse gas and it is potent, but it does not last as long as CO2. So it lasts about 10 years in our environment. And then it is broken down into H2O, which is water, which becomes part of the water cycle, like rain, and CO2, which is carbon dioxide. But the CO2 is now taken up again by the grasses. The O2 is released and we breathe that. And the carbon becomes grass, it becomes the roots, it gets leaked down into the soil to feed the bacteria and the fungal communities down there. And about 40% can actually be sequestered in the soil to build new soil. And then the cow eats the carbon and the whole cycle begins again. So this is a cyclical pattern. And we don't have more belching ruminant animals here in North America than we did prior to the 1800s, when we annihilated all the bison and deer and all the other animals that were here. So we don't have net more belching animals. We don't have net more biogenic methane than we did up until about the 1800s. So it's a non-issue. Fossil fuels, on the other hand, are pumping up ancient sequestered methane and carbon from the Earth's core and exposing it directly into our atmosphere. So it's like a brand new molecules that are now floating around, and there is no natural balance reuptake of those. And so that's the issue. It's the burning of the fossil fuels, the pumping up of all of these, our consumerism, transportation, industry, electric generation. That is the problem with global warming. It's not farting or belching cows.
Just to summarize, I think what you just said, that the cow is basically part of a natural cycle. And everything basically rotates round about that. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it comes back to the same point and it goes on. Whereas with the ancient sequestered carbon, if you're actually taking it out of the ground, either as gas or coal or petroleum, then essentially it's a one-way street.
That's exactly right. And there's other issues with the global numbers, like what you mentioned earlier in the podcast. There's been a long shadow. Well, there was actually a study called Livestock's Long Shadow that said livestock contribute more greenhouse gases than transportation to the environment. But what they did was they looked at the full life cycle of producing meat. So growing, if it's a grain finished animal, growing that grain, the transport of the animal, the processing, the retail, transportation, getting it into people's homes. They looked at that whole cycle and all of the greenhouse gases as part of that. So including transportation greenhouse gases. But in the case of transportation, they didn't account for anything other than just tailpipe emissions. So there is no life cycle assessment on the full transportation industry. So mining the products to make the metal and everything else that's required for the cars, the transportation, the emissions in the factories producing these cars, none of that was considered. And so when you look at just the emissions from transportation versus the emissions from cattle, we have a very, very different numbers. And that's what you need to do. You need to compare apples to apples. And so transportation is about 14% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and all of livestock is only 5%. And then when you look at, again, livestock is part of a cycle and transportation is not, then we can see that we really need to be looking at transportation as the main culprit, not burping cows.
Given the fact that, what you've said there just now is demonstrable, you can prove it, do you get frustrated at the fact there are still so many people running about saying, yep, cattle produce more greenhouse gases than transport?
Yeah, it drives me crazy. And, things just get repeated and repeated. And of course, we're living in this world of social media where it's really easy to say meat is evil, meat is murder. You just heard me explain why cow farts aren't killing the planet. It takes a minute. And it actually takes, you have to think for a second about it and actually use your brain a little bit. And that is just not the world we're living in today. And so, the whole book is that. I'm really breaking it, like with water. They'll say, it takes 10 bathtubs full of water to eat, a burger. And I'm like, well, think about this just for a minute, because cows urinate. So it's not like they're just sucking it up and the water's being wasted like a blimp or something like that. And so, and then the water numbers, as I mentioned in the book, most of the water attributed to that burger is actually rain that would have fallen on the pasture, whether or not there was a cow on it. And so we really have to look at, what are they counting as water? Are they looking at moisture in the grass and rain, or are they actually looking at drinking water? Was that water then urinated out? And, what's the difference between that and the water used to make sugary candy? Because you need a lot of irrigation for that and a lot of waste in the factory. So anyway, it's, you really just need someone's attention for a few minutes. And so what I've done in the film is really try to break all that out. We have some nice animations that explain some of this. We have a nice demonstration about water too, and how healthy grasslands actually soak up water much better than cropping, which allows for runoff. So people just kind of bear with me for a minute. I feel like I have a really compelling case, but it's been quite interesting, the media reception to this. And I actually even used to work for National Public Radio here in the US, and the New York Times. I mean, none of them want to touch this story because it is just so different from the mainstream narrative. And it's also seen politically as really questionable because vegetarians are associated with being politically liberal. And so when I say eating meat is healthy and cow farts aren't destroying the planet, it's assumed that I'm conservative and I might as well be, representing Donald Trump. And so that's also been quite problematic for me because I'm trying to sell environmentalists and people who really want to be quite conscious about what they're eating. But as soon as I say that maybe vegetarians and vegans are wrong, I'm immediately put into this political category and basically canceled.
There's a lot of information in Sacred Cow. I mean, it would be quite easy to get swamped by it. You really have to. I mean, I found myself going through it quite carefully, quite methodically. But every so often something jumps out at you and you think, yeah, I'm going to hang on to that bit of information. One of it was 86% of global livestock feed is made up of materials that we can't eat. Now, that's relevant to us here in Scotland because the vast majority of beef and sheep farms here in Scotland are forage-based systems, what you would describe as grass-fed. So what advice would you give to folk here involved in the red meat industry when it comes to actually laying out the case for it? What points should they be trying to get across?
I've been to Scotland. It's beautiful, but you can't grow crops that will feed Scotland. What you find in the grocery store is not well produced in Scotland year round, right? But what is produced well is red meat. You guys are really good at growing grass. So is England, so is Ireland, so is the US, in fact. And when we plant crops, we destroy the soil. Ecosystems don't want to be monocrops. They want to be healthy. They want to be grazed. And so the most natural food that could be produced is animal sourced foods. And a lot of urban people really enjoy visiting the country, but they don't understand that in order to keep the country beautiful, you need to have strong rural economies and, well-paid farmers. And that can only happen when we reject the ultra-processed food industry, which is pushing these plant-based products, and support farmers that are growing the food and taking care of this environment that they like to visit every once in a while. And so when I was visiting with James Rebanks in the Lake District with the lamb, I was trying to encourage him to come up with like a Lake District lamb kind of co-op, right? So that people knew when they were buying his lamb and not the lamb from Montana or New Zealand, that they were supporting a farmer who was really stewarding the land of the Lake District and keeping it the beautiful place that everybody loves it to be. And I think there's something to that. And I hope that the farmers who are doing the same thing in Scotland really try to push the fact that if you love Scotland, you will support the farmers who are doing the best job of stewarding the land, which are the ones who are managing grazing animals.
Are you suggesting that everybody tries to eat more meat or to eat better meat?
Well, that's an interesting question. So what people are eating is largely dependent on their bodies, right? And so I don't have a blanket prescription. I think that's wrong, which is one of the other reasons why I'm very against that Eat Land Set diet, because how could you possibly dictate one diet for all people? But I do believe humans are omnivores and we do need animal source foods in order to thrive. So I strongly disagree that a vegan diet is optimal. I think some people, for some reasons, do a little bit better than others avoiding meat, but I think only good things can come from actually incorporating meat in your diet. As far as quantities go, I encourage people to buy the best meat they can afford. So, I do believe in good grazing techniques. I've seen farms here in the US that do great grazing, but then finish on a feedlot because economically it just works out better for the farmer that way. And, when the grains are grown locally and also those animals are being fed leftovers from our ethanol industry that have no other use in our food system, right? So like the corn stalks from when we make ethanol, which is a ridiculous process here. But we can actually feed those corn stalks to cattle and they can upcycle that into protein. So I'm not necessarily against feedlot finished cattle. I think that all of those animals still spend the majority of their life on pasture and can still be improving ecosystem function while they're on pasture. So I encourage people to just buy the best meat they can access. Not everybody has access to grass-fed beef here, but it's still, I argue as a dietitian, one of the healthiest foods you could be eating. And so no doctor would say only eat organic vegetables or don't eat vegetables. And I actually would argue that it's the same thing with meat. You should just eat meat, try to get the best meat that you can get your hands on, try to buy as local as you can, support the farmers that are doing the best practices as you can. I mean, in other countries, grass-fed is actually cheaper than grain finished because we subsidize grains here in the US. And so it just skews the economics and makes it cheaper for us to be able to finish cattle on grains. But like I said, even when they're finished on a feedlot, it's not necessarily 100% grains that they're eating.
As I said earlier, there was a time when I was a vegetarian. It wasn't on ethical grounds. I just one day stopped liking meat. It was as simple as that. And it took me a wee while to actually come back to it. How do you personally argue with people? I mean, you can argue science, fine, but how do you go about arguing with someone who thinks it is just ethically wrong to eat animals?
You can't. I don't argue. Unless someone wants to pay me to argue with them, it's just such a maddening experience to argue with an ethical vegan. People's ethics are very personal to them. And I mean, you're getting into like almost arguing them out of a religion or a political party. I mean, there's so many reasons why people affiliate with certain communities, and our diets have really become our almost religious identity to a lot of us. And so what you eat is almost making a statement, right, about your ethics in the world. But if someone does intelligently want to, if they're really open-minded and curious, I will talk with them about how from a diet of least harm, which I think is the most laudable, credible, ethical stance someone could take for why they might want to be not consuming animals, right? They want to cause the least amount of harm for their life. I would argue that from a least harm perspective, eating a large ruminant that, so a cow can produce 500 pounds of meat. That's a lot of meat. That's a lot of meat for a lot of people or in a lot of meals. If you were to do 100%, plant-based diet, many, many, many more lives need to be lost in order for that diet to happen, between plowing and pesticides and all the other chemicals used to produce the food. And then post-harvest, a lot of people don't talk about post-harvest with grains. If we didn't kill a lot of rodents, we wouldn't have grains, right? Because it would just be eaten by all the rodents that are circulating around grain mills. So we've got that. Workers are treated horribly. I mean, there's a lot of harm that is happening to produce plant-based diet that looks like there's no death on that plate. And so they might argue, but I didn't intend for that death to happen, so it didn't happen. And I would just say, in a court of law, actually, that wouldn't stand up. Now that I've told you that all those little bunnies and birds and mice and deer are dying for you to consume that diet. And James Ray Banks talks about, yes, we're probably going to have to kill Bambi. If you want to eat lettuce, Bambi might have to die because deer really love coming over to a gigantic salad bar and you can't have that. So now that you know all of this, you can't claim no intent. So I kind of go through arguments like that in my book and just kind of point out that is a diet of least harm. Would that include chocolate when we look at all the child slavery that's happening in the chocolate industry and all the human trafficking that's happening? Like, is it okay for you to eat chocolate just because it wasn't a cow dying? So I go deep into that stuff in the book.
Your book is, as I said earlier, excellent. A lot of good information in it. Any suggestions for other places where people could find this kind of information?
It's really dangerous for a dietitian to come out and say this. I could definitely lose my license because this is against the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics position statement on vegetarian and vegan diets, which happens, that position statement was written by all vegetarians and vegans. So talk about a conflict of interest there. It's much easier to make money, and this is not a money-making proposition. I'm not getting paid very well to do these talks and produce a documentary film, which took 4 years and no income on. Saying something that's unpopular definitely doesn't win you a lot of friends. I'm just trying to support people that are doing the right thing, that are keeping our rural economies alive, that are keeping ecosystems well functioning by doing the right thing. There are some groups in the US. There's a Savory Institute. There's a Sustainable Food Trust. I work with Patrick Holden often in England. So there are some groups that are doing great stuff. And I think we just need to make sure that we're educating young people so that they're not leaving farms and going to work at a bank, and that they're staying. We keep our smart people at home and keep these traditions going.
Diana, it's been a real, genuine pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. And so the film, if anyone wants to check it out, it's on iTunes. It's called Sacred Cow. The book Sacred Cow is available in many places where books are sold. And people can follow me on Instagram at Sustainable Dish is my nutrition feed. And I talk about that there. And then more information about the book and the film is at sacredcow.info. And that's where I have a lot of infographics and blog posts about all of this. And then finally, I'm just doing some shameless plugs here. I hope you don't mind.
Crack on.
The Global Food Justice Alliance is the new group that so far we have over 100 doctors, dietitians, and academics who are all pushing back against the United Nations adoption of this very meat-phobic Eat Land Set diet and just sort of this global anti-meat agenda. So this is an independent group that is just very, very concerned from a science perspective about the adoption of plant-based diets worldwide.
I managed to order Sacred Cow online, and it got delivered the next day. I am not going to pretend that anybody's going to sit down and read it from cover to cover, because it takes time to absorb. There's a lot of information in there, but it is well worth the effort. I'm Mark Stephen on behalf of myself and Diana Rodgers. Thank you very much for listening to this. I hope you found it useful.
Thank you for listening to the Quality Meat Scotland podcast. For news and to listen back to previous episodes of the podcast, visit qmscotland.co.uk. For Scotch beef, Scotch lamb and specially selected pork recipe videos and inspiration, visit www.scotchkitchen.com or follow Scotch Kitchen on Facebook, Instagram or Twitter.